Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today's video is going to be about a camera which a lot of you will find really interesting. Today's camera is the Leica M6. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage cameras in my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I have an Etsy store which is also called Japan Vintage Camera. So if you'd like to buy this Leica or another vintage camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. So, the Leica M6 was introduced back in 1984, and that was an especially good year for me. 1984, and it was an improved version of the Leica M4. So a lot of you may say, well, the M6 is an improved version of the Leica M4. Wasn't there a Leica M5? And why was the M6 produced after the M4? And there actually was a Leica M5, which was, I guess, designed in Germany to replace the Leica M4. And the M5 was a much more technologically advanced camera with a through-the-lens light meter. But it was kind of an ugly camera in many respects. The overall design wasn't as pleasing as the earlier Leica cameras, and it had this zinc construction of the top and bottom covers, and the color finish on the cameras was a little bit fragile, so it's kind of easy to scratch them and see the zinc underneath. And a lot of people didn't really like how big the cameras were. And I guess Leica's designers, or I guess the factory in Canada, kind of saw that the M6 was going to be a flop, and they brought the Leica M4 back into production, but with a few things which were borrowed from the M5, mainly some of the materials used in the construction of the M5, and a few other minor improvements, but basically the same camera as the earlier M4. Later versions, Leicas were made with, I guess, the zinc or magnesium top and bottom covers, which were durable, maybe not as nice as the brass, but probably a little bit more protective to the internal mechanism than the brass covers were, and I guess less expensive to manufacture at the time. We can't forget that in the 1970s, times were bad. And inflation was pretty bad, and a lot of companies were losing money, and they tried to reduce costs in many different ways in order to, I guess, stay in business and keep paying their bills and paying their workers. So Leica wasn't exempt from the problems of the days, but for the most part, their M4 cameras, the newer M4, M4P and such, which were made in the 70s and early 80s, were still quite good cameras. They have that same nice buttery smooth feel and quiet operation the earlier cameras had, but because they were made in this era, they didn't really have the same, I guess, reputation for quality or the desirability. The M4 is probably the least expensive of the Leica M cameras right now, the one you can find for the lowest price. But for the most part, things got better in the 1980s when businesses started to make money again, and people began to spend more money again and began to want to buy nicer things. So in 1984, Leica brought out the M6 and shared a little bit of the features of the M4 camera, like the rewind dial here, and a little bit of the lines from like the M3, which you can see a little bit on the front under the rangefinder window. It was a very much more advanced camera and had a really long production run. It was made up until the early 2000s, and quite a large number of these were sold to Leica fans. And of course they used all the earlier Leica M-mount lenses, and by the 1980s these were being made by other manufacturers as well. And there's really a big boom of M-mount lenses made by, say, Konica, Minolta, Voigtlander and other makers, which gives you a lot of options for lenses on these cameras. Another good thing about these cameras, for myself, I had one of these several years ago, M6, kind of the black chrome version. And I used that camera for about a year along with the M4 I was using at the time, and I really liked it. It was just as smooth and had the same balance and all that as my M4, but with the added feature of a built-in light meter. And with these two cameras, I could just load them with different kinds of film and different lenses, and have one available for the correct one available for whatever I was going to be shooting at. And I bought the camera back in those days, and it was quite reasonably priced. I think my M6 cost me about $800 back then for a really clean example with the original box. And then I came across Leica M4 MOT, which is quite a scarce camera, very collectible, and I really wanted it, so I decided to sell my M6. And I sold my M6 and I got about $200 more than what I paid for it. And nowadays they go for much more money yet. These cameras, the Leicas, cameras like this, tend to be a really good investment. They are expensive, but if you eventually decide to sell them, you're at least going to get your money back, and often, you know, you're likely to get more money, and sometimes much more than what you paid for them. So this camera was introduced back in 1984, and as I said, that was an interesting year for me. In those days, I was kind of trading in cars. I was a high school student. And in America, you know, high school kids love to drive, and I was in the auto shop in those days, and I had friends, and we used to kind of trade in cars to make money. We'd go out in the weekends and we'd hunt up these old muscle cars and things like that, and we would buy them, we would clean them up and resell them, and maybe make a few hundred, sometimes a few $1,000s on each one, depending on what it was. Yesterday, I think it was, I was reading an article in the news about someone who had made a barn find and found an old 65 or 66 Shelby GT350. And that these cars sold for about, nowadays, in good condition, for about $300,000. Back in the 1980s, age Shelby GT350 was worth about $15,000 or something like that. And 1984, I had a Shelby GT500KR 1967 with a big block and 4-speed in mint condition with only 12,000 miles on it. I paid $8,000 for this car, which was a hell of a lot of money back in 1984, but less money than my mom paid for her new Mercury Capri. And I resold this car and I made $2,000 on it, and I was quite happy. But how much do you think a 1967 Shelby GT500KR would sell for in 2022? It kind of sickens me to think about that, but sell it I did. And with the money I bought a 1970 Plymouth 446 pack Cuda. And that car cost me about $3,000 in very good condition, and you can imagine what one of those is worth nowadays. So I kind of kick myself for not holding on to these cars in the old days, and a lot of these cameras today are kind of the same way. My Leica M4 MOT, which I paid about $1,600 for, is worth maybe 3 times that amount today. So anyway, to put it all in a nutshell, these cameras are a good investment. So whatever you're going to pay for them, eventually, you know, you'll be able to sell it for more. So let's go ahead and take a look at the features, controls, and functions, and how to use the Leica M6. There were a couple of different versions available. There was the Leica M6 and a later model which was called the M6 TTL, and you can kind of tell the M6 TTL because of the differences in the shutter speed dial. The M6, standard M6, has a smaller, simpler dial like this, and then the M6 TTL has a larger dial with an off thing for switching the power off in the camera. This camera has a battery-powered light meter, which uses a couple of meter indicator arrows in the viewfinder. The batteries fit in this cover in the front, and this camera uses commonly available LR44 batteries. On the top, I mentioned before, we have the old M4 style rewind knob. The top is completely flat, which allows you to set the camera on a flat surface to make it easier to reload the film. We have a shoe over here for mounting a flash. These didn't have automatic flash control, but I believe Leica did make a flash which mounted on the M6 and kind of shared the kind of lines and design of the M6. We have the shutter speed dial here, as I just mentioned, with a range of B and 1 second up to 1/1000th of a second. And I really love how smooth and quiet everything is. We have the film winding and shutter charging lever, and we have this kind of plastic doohickey which Leica introduced with the M4, which they say makes it kind of easier to catch the button. A lot of people kind of replace these with the M3 style metal one. You can do that with this camera as well. Here we have the shutter release button, which accepts a standard cable release, and here we have the film counter window. On the back of the camera here we have a viewfinder window, and Leica made adapters for these, diopter adapters to adjust to your eyesight. We have a PC sync socket on the back, and then we have this dial here, which is similar to the dial on the earlier cameras, but this one is an electronic dial, which you must use to program the film speed, because this camera does have an electric light meter. At the bottom of the camera, we have a standard 1/4-inch tripod socket located this side, and here we have the catch and lever that you need to remove the bottom cover to put in the film, and I'll describe that in a couple of minutes. On the front of the camera, let me put that on the right way. Yeah, you don't want to do this if you have film, put it on the wrong way. So I mentioned the cover here to install the batteries before. Here we have the button which you use to release the lens. Here we have the rewind button. You just push this toward the R and that allows you to rewind the film. We have the rangefinder window up here. This window here is the Fresnel window, which allows light to go on the frame lines, so they show up nice and bright in the viewfinder. And of course we have the viewfinder here. On the bottom here we have this lever which looks like a self-timer lever, but this is actually the frame line preview lever, or lever which allows you to move the frame lines one way or the other. When you install a Leica M mount lens, it automatically selects the frame lines for that particular lens. The good thing about this camera, the M6, like the M4, allows you to use a 35mm lens. The earlier cameras you had, like the M3, you needed an accessory finder for the top, or you need the goggles attachment to use the 35mm lens. With the M6 or M4, it automatically can select the 35mm lens, and certain ones with different magnifications can allow you to use the 28mm lens. Now there were different, as I said, magnifications, I guess, for 0.58, 0.73, and 0.85, if I remember, and the different magnifications allow for better use with the different either wide angle, standard, or telephoto types of lenses. The lens on this camera is a 50mm f2 Summicron lens. This is one of the most highly regarded lenses for the Leica camera. A lot of people who shoot the Leicas prefer the 50mm lens, because that was the lens which Henri Cartier-Bresson used to take most of his, or pretty much all of his famous photographs. He was a one lens man though he used a variety of 50mm lenses, he always shot in the 50mm focal length. As I said, a large variety of lenses are available for this camera. Leica made a lot of lenses from, say, the 21mm Super Angulon up to the 135mm telephotos. They were different things with, I guess, reflex adapters on the camera, which allowed for super telephotos and SLR style focusing. Lenses are made which will fit this camera. You can use the Minolta or Konica M mount lenses, because both these companies made Leica mount cameras back in the day. And then of course other makers like Voigtlander and such also make M mount lenses. So if you have one of these cameras, you have a really huge variety of lenses to choose from. A lot of people really like the big, fast, sexy lenses on these cameras. They think that the faster lenses are more sexy. Unfortunately, the 1/1000 top speed kind of limits what you can do with these really fast lenses. For myself, the standard 50mm Summicron is the best lens, or the 35mm f2 Summicron lens. Those are my two favorites, and pretty much the only lenses I would really want for one of these cameras. I've had both of them and I love them. Personally, I prefer the 35mm lens for shooting indoors and shooting people. I really love how that works, and the 50mm for everything else. I've been wanting to get a 21mm Super Angulon, and maybe next month or so I'll go ahead and pick one of those up and go out and try it out a little bit. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at how to load the film in one of these cameras, because loading film in a Leica M is a lot different from most other cameras. You have to remove the film door, and here you have kind of a guide showing you how to put in the film. You have to pop open this door like so, and you pull out the film leader on the camera, and you carefully, this one has a film canister already inside of it, but you drop in the film canister here, and with the film leader pulled across, and you kind of have to carefully push the film leader. Oh, excuse me. There it comes. I'll have to see what this is. Provia 100F daylight. So you push the film down carefully and make sure that the leader fits into this three-pronged thing here. It shows here how it should go, and you have to really make sure that you push the film all the way down so it gets caught by the take-up sprockets. Otherwise, you'll go out and start shooting with the camera and you're thinking you're taking a lot of really wonderful shots, but the film isn't actually winding. And I know that from experience, that that's easy to do. Go ahead and drop this film cartridge back here. I'm going to have to develop that and see what's on that film. I'm not sure when it was put in, but then you close it up. And a good way to make sure that the film is winding is to kind of turn the rewind spool until it's kind of tight, and then as you wind up to number 1, if you can feel this turning, that means the film is loaded right on the spool and it's working properly, and then the camera is ready to go. To shoot, you wind the film and charge the shutter, and you look through the viewfinder and you set the aperture ring and the shutter speed ring until the 2 arrows line up in the viewfinder, and that means that you have the exposure correct. If one arrow is pointing or the other arrow is pointing, you have to adjust either the shutter speed or aperture until everything is set and they are both lit up the right way. And anyway, that's about it for my video about the Leica M6 camera. This one is in the process of being overhauled. It needs to be cleaned out and the lens needs to be overhauled. So once that's done, I'll have this listed up for sale in my stores. If you'd like to buy this camera, please visit. Probably in a few days I should have this done. I have another Leica camera listed right now, a really nice M3. So if you're really looking for a Leica, please go ahead and take a look at what I've got. I expect to be getting more such cameras over the coming weeks and months. So yeah, if you want to see, please visit my stores. If you'd like to see more videos about cameras, please subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.